Ladies and gentlemen, you are listening to or watching the Fantasy Points podcast. Very special guest today, the one and only Sigmund Bloom. I think I've told this story on your show a few times, Sig, uh, but I want to hit it here. So I was like a baseball diehard. I started in the industry as a fantasy baseball writer, obsessed with that. And I didn't like really fall in love with football, fantasy football in particular, until right out of college. I was working this soul sucking 9 to 5 job that I was just so miserable at. The only benefit was you could just listen to podcasts while you did your work, or you have your headphones in while you were working all day. And I found your podcast and I just became obsessed. I listened to every single episode you did. Really caused me to fall in love with fantasy football. I just didn't hear anyone thinking about things on your level. I've always said you're fantasy football's best philosopher. It's just like kind of how your mind works, very outside the box thinker. And yeah, I don't think I would be here where I am if it wasn't for you and your podcast. And whenever I do your show, it's the only show I still get really nervous for, because like that's how much your show means to me. But hopefully now that I'm on my home turf, now you're on my
Right.
couch, things are a little different. We'll see.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that. And, like so many other people in our little sandbox, your work has far surpassed anything that I've done in terms of just dedication and with depth and breadth. And when we were chatting last week and you said, oh, the Bloom 100 matches up with my rankings considerably, I told you, well, that's more reassuring for me at this point. Uh, and I think it's great. And at the very least, I hope what a lot of this stands for, Scott, is that, in the fantasy football world at large stands for this too, is that in a time, in an era, whenever we have a lot of worries, we're all traumatized, we're all struggling, we're all trying to reconstitute things that have been broken or never even activated in our lives that are supposed to nourish our spirits, our souls. We have created this space, a safe space, if you will, where we get to gather around a fire of not football, not professional football, but the complete commitment of all the people involved in professional football and what it creates. And then we can hang out and enjoy it together. And so many people are doing it in so many ways that I feel like we're at a golden age of people being fluent and conversant in these topics so we can have just the most amazing conversations about them.
Yeah, I agree. It's crazy to like you go back and you watch a draft from 8 years ago, the level of discourse versus what it is today. It's at such a higher level, elevated consciousness, if you will.
Hmm.
At the end of every show, you always ask me some off the wall, non-football questions. I know we talked about Alan Watts one time,
Uh-huh.
and so I'll have to come up with something good for you
Yeah.
at the end of this show. You always
Yeah.
have good answers. Um, but yeah, so you brought up the Sigmund Bloom pre-draft 100. Always been one of my favorite articles to read. And I said this to you in DMs, is like, it feels like I'm saying this every year, but we are very aligned. And like your article dropped before my wide receiver article, and very, very similar with these wide receivers. And so I kind of just want to like dig into
Yeah.
this article and kind of ask your question, some questions, see where we're aligned, maybe the few instances where we're not. But I'm looking at the top, the Superflex top 25, right? And so you see Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, Romo Dunze, Brock Bowers. Nothing surprising at all to me there. I know it's different for some other people, but that feels just about perfect to me. The question I have for you is, how tight was it in between Caleb Williams and Jaden Daniels? Because this is
Hmm.
something that's been keeping me up at night. Should Jaden Daniels be the QB1 in this class? And I know that's crazy because everyone's like, oh, Caleb Williams is this generational talent. He is DJ Moore. He is Keenan
Hmm.
Allen. It's
Hmm.
impossible to fail. Caleb Williams is not Brett Whitefield, our preeminent film mind director of charting at Fantasy Points, not his QB1. Had a lot of concerns. But
Hmm.
more importantly, it's just Jaden Daniels, the element he brings as a runner, that Konami code upside, that cheat
Right.
code upside. And you hear people talk about him. It's like, well, maybe he's Lamar Jackson. He might even be a better thrower than Lamar Jackson,
Sure.
or rich man's RG3. And then the floor is Justin Fields. And it's like, I mean, that's great. Justin
Mhm.
Fields was a mid-range QB1 every time he was on the field, and like he was not good. And like I
Right.
think this guy's way better. And to just have that Konami code cheat code upside is just like so massive in fantasy. So my question to you, how tight was it between these two names? And like, do you see any do you find that argument at all compelling that he could be the QB1?
Oh, I think that it's certainly within the range of possibilities, and they're tight enough. I'll say this, Scott. They're tight enough that we know the Caleb Williams situation, Shane Waldron, an offensive line that is gelling, Keenan Allen, DJ Moore, Cole Kmet, Gerald Everett, right? And it's not simply those pieces, it's the commitment by the organization to, as Matt Williamson put it on my show, build a nest for him. This is what makes Caleb Williams so different than every other quarterback that has gone number one overall. Is they're usually
Mm,
rescuing a franchise at the trough, at the bottom
mm,
of their curve, and he is joining a franchise that is going up. And when we look at Jaden Daniels' most likely scenario, it is going to Washington. We've already seen Cliff Kingsbury and Kyler Murray and how that went. Not great, even though it was his handpicked guy. It was a guy he's been looking at across the room for 5, 6 years, and he yet didn't create an atmosphere. That's the interesting thing about Cliff Kingsbury and Air Raid. And I guess as we're at the cliffhanger here, some folks might be watching this after the draft. Is it Drake May? I mean, isn't Drake May actually more of the Air Raid quarterback than Jaden Daniels? Now, where does Jaden Daniels go if he's not number two? New England, don't love that. Not
mhm,
fan. I mean, New England does not seem like a place that fosters the best possible development of players. And then, well, would the Raiders trade up? I think if he gets to three, the Raiders, not Minnesota. I think the Raiders are the team we have to look at. I'm not loving that. Luke Getsy, this is the guy we're talking about what he didn't do with Justin Fields. Now he gets Jaden
yep.
Daniels. So when I run through these scenarios, that's actually the gap because Jaden
Mhm.
Daniels, from a fantasy perspective, is ideal. It's just a question of 3, 4, 5 years down the line. Are we still going to be able to count on him? I feel more confident about that with Caleb Williams, even though he doesn't have for fantasy quite as high of a ceiling. Now, if Daniels ends up in Minnesota, Scott, we might flip
Mhm.
that ranking.
I think that was perfectly put. I think that's really important added context and nuance that just wasn't thinking about. You're right. Like the gap between a Chicago landing spot and the other three is massive. Where it's like, hey, probably not, but like, hey, if Justin Fields went to, a better OC with a better supporting cast, maybe he wouldn't have been just recently traded for a round 5 pick.
Right.
So I think that's super important, and like that's something I kind of neglect. Like I just wrote half the length of Catcher in the Rye based on like the analytics of all these rookie players, where it's so much of it is landing spot dependent, where two guys, they're clones. One goes to the right OC who knows how to use him. The other goes to a donkey OC or
Right.
a regime that's about to get turned over the following season. One's a Pro Bowler, the other's a bust, and like that absolutely can be the case.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, I was just going to say DJ Moore is a perfect example of this, and
mhm,
he's not even in an ideal situation. He was with Justin Fields and Luke Getsy, but that's when we finally got to see what DJ Moore could do. How long did it take? So, but I think what you're doing is valuable though, because what you're doing makes sense in this part of the process because you're talking about what we know. We don't know destination yet. So
mhm.
I like idle chatter, unfortunately.
So I don't know if you have anything to add on this. I just remember we were
No.
talking about this. So you have Brock Bauer 6 within the tier, the big
Yeah.
crucial tier, and then at the end of it. And I think that's right. Like looking at his analytics profile, like I can nitpick some things, like very screen dependent, but just like his production relative to Lad McConkey,
Right.
a round
Right.
2 pick, Adonai Mitchell, a round 1 pick, Jermaine, just smashing them. Looks, I said, like no worse than the second best tight end prospect in at least a decade.
Right.
And so the uh, mock draft industrial complex, we hear them saying, yeah, but like he's not going to go so early in the draft because, he's a tight end. And you look at the contracts these wide receivers are getting and the contracts that tight ends are getting, it just doesn't really make sense. And my counter was just, well, look at that second contract, because like if you're drafting a guy here, you're expecting to get them on this second contract. And not just that, but it's like I've always maintained that like in the aggregate, tight ends aren't very valuable, but highest end tight ends are among the most valuable players in all of football. Rob Gronkowski
Hmm.
was the most valuable non-quarterback of his era when he was on the field. When he was missing games, Vegas shaved, what was it, like
Right.
4.5 points off of their total, which was more than any other non-quarterback by a landslide, and more than a lot of good quarterbacks. And like Steve Buzzard, who worked for you guys at Football Guys, basically does this his own model. He was saying the exact same thing. It's like, no. Gronk is the non-quarterback goat of his era, elite blocker, best, per target efficiency of any receiver. And that's just so valuable to an offense. And so I know we communicate a little bit about this. I don't
Hmm.
remember exactly what you said, but what are your thoughts on Brock Bowers as a prospect, maybe for fantasy, but also in terms of NFL value to a team?
Yeah, and I've been quoting you a lot. I mean, I always quote you a lot. I've been quoting you a lot in this cycle because a couple of things that you did. Well, first of all, because even though you're working from a model and you're inputting a lot of numbers, you still understand the story that those numbers tell. So when you make that, and I just quoted you on our show today about this idea that, well, let's just assume that Georgia is at, or especially in those few years, the top of college football, was the best program in college football. And then you look at all of the future NFL talent that was with Brock Bowers at an early point in his career. And that they looked at these guys and they said, that guy is a guy that's going to be central in our offense. That's meaningful. That's really meaningful. We talk about breakout age and market share, whatever. That's meaningful,
Mhm.
and it makes me think that another wrinkle, and then we can only do this backwards looking, is how much NFL talent was a player playing with, and that makes market share a little bit different because I think we're getting into this where it's skewing, say, like Mitchell and Worthy and things like that, yards per route run and so on. But I think you pointed that out as important. And then the other thing that, and I love how, and you and I are birds of a feather like this, where when everybody is saying something, examine the other side. Just look at the other side. I'm not even saying you have to truck with the other side and say everyone's wrong, but at least consider it. And if the problem is you're not banking, and I just quoted you on this morning too, if you're not banking all this surplus value, wide receiver tops out at 30 million a year, quarterback 45 million, offensive tackle 30 million, whatever, and a rookie contract, you're not banking this extra money, right? Because tight end only makes 12 million or 14 million. If you're right about the player, and why are you drafting them if you don't think you're right, then you're going to make that back on the second contract because you're talking about a player that's as impactful as a wide receiver on your passing game, but you only have to pay half the amount. And the NFLPA has allowed the teams to control this. It's how they're listed on the depth chart. Brock Bowers could line up 100% of the snaps detached from the formation. And if they put him at tight end on the depth chart, then he's going to be a tight end when it comes to figuring out what his fifth year option is, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you put all that stuff together, and then you're saying, well, maybe a smart organization is the one looking at Brock Bowers, who everybody has as a top 5 overall prospect. Nobody argues about that. They just argue about where he should go in the draft because they're overthinking it. And then we get into possibilities again. Jets at number 10 is where we start. Oh, that would be sad. I would not be happy about that. Denver at number 12, I think if they don't take a quarterback, it will probably be Brock Bowers, assuming he's there. Then we're looking at Indianapolis. I don't know how to feel about that, Scott. I don't know. I mean, I want to like it. I mean, really, what we're hoping for is that enough teams buy into this tight end devalue argument, and he falls all the way to Cincinnati at 18. Then confetti, party's on.
You just said a few things that I think were great. You kind of like cut through the noise. Like, yeah, I could riddle off yards per route run, market share stats all day on Brock Bowers, but at the end of the day, he was the best offensive player at 18 and 19 on two incredibly stacked national championship winning teams with a quarterback who was ultimately drafted day 3. Like, that
Right.
is just insane. And it circles back to what we were just saying about the importance of a highest end tight end. And then you also said how, like, I love picking your brain on process. I
Mm-hmm.
just like love the way you think. You're such a unique thinker in this space. You have to look at the other side of the argument. And that's like the most important thing. And like that's what I do in my evaluations. Like my rookie articles, it's basically here is the upside argument, here is the downside argument, and here's most likely. Like that's the way to think.
Hmm.
But like in fantasy, just like in on Wall Street, right? Like all the best investors ever, Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger, Seth Klarman, they all call themselves contrarian investors because that's where all the money is. You
Hmm.
buy low, you sell high. And in fantasy, it's the same thing. All of my best calls were the ones where I was going against the wisdom of the crowd and I fell in love with the contrarian argument. It's Lamar Jackson sucked as a rookie, he's going to be a bust. And I'm like, I'm actually going to bet him to win MVP. And lo and behold, or Christian McCaffrey, like sophomore season, it's he's too small. He was inefficient. And it's like, well, you know what? Le'Veon Bell was inefficient as a rookie. LaDainian Tomlinson was inefficient as a rookie. And there's all these other things. So, yeah, I think I would quantify you as a contrarian as well as myself. And I
Yeah.
think that's where all the value is in this market.
Yeah. Well, it is because I mean, this is something I try to touch on once a year or so. Well, first, actually, since you said buy low, sell high, and I that's one of the one of the columns I write at Football Guys is called buy low, sell high, and I've been writing it for I don't even know how long now, longer than some of the people listening to this probably been alive. But now, Scott, a lot of what I write up in that column is buy high and sell low because the information is so good and it's disseminated so quickly and so thoroughly that you can't find buy lows and sell highs anymore. It's actually you have to sort through the buy lows and figure out which ones are the fugazis so you can take advantage of that. And actually you should be when people are saying buy low, it's really a sell low. You just have to figure out which ones are the sell lows. Likewise with the buy highs, right? If you bought CJ Stroud when everyone was starting to wake up to how good he was 6-8 weeks into the season last year, you won. You won that trade. I don't even care what you gave up. You won that trade at a time when he was a high. He was a player on the rise. So
Mm.
I think because of that, the contrarian view, I mean, this is one of the weird things about doing what we do is you do have to, on some level, be aware of what other people think. That's whether that's through ADP or reading other people's articles or Twitter, or even just fielding questions, even just fielding trade questions and start sit questions. You start, okay, this is what people are actually thinking, because it isn't just being right. It's understanding where the biggest gaps, the most arbitrage is between what we think is likely to happen and what people are projecting. So, I do think you have to look at what if everyone's wrong. And then the other thing I like to say is the true buy low, sell high, or getting the inflection point. I always talk about it in
Mhm.
terms of inflection points. You're trying to jump in at the inflection point in a curve, either where it's topped out and it's about to come down, or it's at its trough and it's about to come up again. It should feel scary, right? Like the best buy
Mhm.
low, sell high deals you make at the time, like you probably are doubting yourself. You're like, well, geez, I really might be like stepping in it right now and cleaning off my shoes for a while because if you're going contrarian, it's going to be scary. You're going to see the weight, including of people that you trust, saying this is not the right move to make. But that's what makes this fun in the end, and why people should still. I mean, winning money and so on is great, but having it be your team with your decisions, isn't this why we started doing this? So we could be the GM. So
Mhm.
play around, have some fun, do some things that seem crazy, because the other thing they think that people underestimate about fantasy football or just the fortunes rising and falling, and this could go back to MLB too. You're talking about baseball, all kinds of things that sound insane 3 months later become the conventional wisdom. 3 months later, that's all it takes. I mean, sometimes 1 month later. So don't be too stuck on what everybody thinks.
Yeah, I loved your point on buying high and then just like selling even higher. I was just thinking about like imagine like being in a dynasty league in
Hmm.
2001, right?
Hmm.
You're selling high on Tom Brady with a second round rookie pick, right?
Right. Right.
Or 2003, you're selling high on Tom Brady, two rookie pick.
Right.
In 2006, five rookie pick. And guess what? All those are wins for you. You just
Right.
you
Right.
sold 10 first round picks and held on Tom Brady. Like that could have been the value you were getting to your super flex roster. But you also mentioned arbitrage plays. And when I look at Brian Thomas, who's you have at 8, this is like one of our big disagreements, I think, except like we're aligned with rankings. Like that's exactly where I have him.
Hmm.
It's just like I kept coming up with arbitrage plays I liked more. The big concern I had with him, he looked, and I think you hit on this in your write up, is he looked pretty one dimensional to
Yeah.
me, or like he was a late breakout with like only one good year, and his quarterback won the Heisman in that year, and he didn't really sniff Malik Neighbors, and then 50% of his yards came on just one route, the go route. It was an elite season by. It was the best ever season in PFF college history by yards per deep target,
Hmm.
but it's like that's kind of really all he showed you. And so I like Jermaine Burton as an arbitrage play, another guy who is like
Hmm.
really only a deep threat, but great at it. And there are a few other names like that.
Sure.
But when I look at that, I see, and again, this is my wide receiver 4, but I look at that and I see a player who's probably better in real life than fantasy. Because, like, think about Will Fuller, think about
Sure.
Torrey Smith, even Deshaun Jackson. Who were those guys? They were frustratingly volatile on a week to week basis, better in real football than fantasy. And then I also think about like maybe this archetype is even worth less in today's day and age with the
Sure.
rise of too high coverage,
Hmm.
designed to stop the deep ball. So I don't know. Did you struggle with him as much as I did? To me, I love the big three. I think they're all guaranteed wide receiver ones, all
Yes.
worst case scenario, Drake London, and then a massive tier littered with wide receiver 2s and 3s who are going to be landing spot dependent beyond that.
Yeah, I think that I put them in an order. And look, Brian Thomas is first because he's likely to be drafted first,
Mhm.
and he's likely to be a first round pick. And I mean, think that draft capital should still it matters. It matters. I'm going to quote Ryan Riddle for the second time today. Early draft picks have to prove they can't play. Late draft
Mhm.
picks have to prove they can. So first round draft picks are going to get a lot of chances, a lot. And Brian Thomas is likely to be the fourth wide receiver off the board, probably in the middle of the first round. But if he goes to Indianapolis, right, he may fall in behind 5 or 6 guys that are ahead of him, that he's ahead of right now. Like, who's Buffalo take, right? That's what everybody wants. Everybody wants Buffalo to come up for Brian Thomas. That solidifies him as number 4 because then now you have a quarterback and you have a role where he doesn't have to really grow. But to your larger point, which I think is important, speed wide receivers present value in ways that don't necessarily show up on their statistics. So Xavier Worthy, even why did Henry Ruggs go as the first wide receiver in a class with CeeDee Lamb? It's because it distorts the defense. And you mentioned 2 high safeties. You mentioned that as taking away the big play downfield, and uh, you have to play 2 high safeties when one of those guys is on the field. So that might diminish their stats. But now what do you have? You have the running game, and that's going to have lighter boxes for the running game. And otherwise, the spacing of the defense is going to open up more. So a player, I don't know if it was you or Thor, that compared Brian Thomas to Christian Watson. And
Probably Thor, but that's a good one.
that's a good one. Yeah, I thought that was really good because what is Christian now, hamstring aside, what is Christian Watson going to be worth in fantasy now? Because you have all of these complementary pieces that can play different roles, and it's not just okay, some weeks Christian Watson's going to have 3 catches for 150 yards and 2 touchdowns. Some weeks he might only have 2 catches for 19 yards, but everybody else will feast because the defense has devoted more attention and resources to making sure he doesn't beat them over the top. And so now where it gets really fun with someone like Brian Thomas is if he does start to develop those other parts of the route tree. Can you think of someone that did that though? Really? I mean, DK Metcalf has been a hit, but not because he's learned all the other nuances of the route tree. It's just because he's so dominant in what he does well. And I think that's the other thing about this class that's really confounding, but also hopeful, is that the wide receiver position is segmented really out into 3 roles, and it's the WR position. But teams are smart and understand that we're going to only use this player in this. Like, another good example is releases, right? I can't even tell you. I think Aaron Kelly comes to mind, a long receiver with some build up speed from Clemson. I remember watching him at the Shrine Game practices. This is like 16 years ago. And he never even saw the field because he could not solve press coverage. He could not figure out how to get a release. teams are understanding now how to get those guys free, right? And we have so many of these little guys. Forget about the next Debo Samuel. Who's the next Tank Dell, right? We have so
Mhm.
many of these little mighty might types in this class, Scott, where you'd say, oh boy, they're going to get manhandled by press coverage, or how many snaps in the slot can you really free up for a guy like this? But teams are getting better at setting up these receivers to do what they know they already do well in the context of their scheme. So that makes us circle all the way back to, well, where does he land? Is this team a team that develops players well, that puts them in roles that they're going to win? Does he have a good quarterback? Is the offense going to function well? The offensive coordinator, et cetera, et cetera. And that means whatever the second tier, 4 to whatever, 16, 18, it's going to get totally shuffled. If you're not shuffling it based on what happens in the draft, then you're not being honest about how important that is to their eventual outcome.
Yeah. So you just mentioned this, and I think you retweeted a thread I did about this,
Mhm.
particularly that Xavier Worthy and Troy Franklin, the low BMI
Right.
uh, speedsters, are going to be the most landing spot dependent wide receivers in this class. It was based around this quote from Greg Cassell, who was saying, yeah,
Yeah.
Tank Dell wouldn't have been drafted 5 years ago. But now in today's day and age, with forward thinking OCs, they're getting players like this free access off the ball where their route isn't impeded by press
Yep.
or physical, bigger cornerbacks, uh, allowing them to show their strengths with like lateral agility and explosiveness and things like that. And that's so massively important. And so for Franklin and Worthy, I'm like very, very landing spot dependent. Where do you want them to go? You want them to go to a motion heavy team.
Right.
And no surprise, the top 6 motion heavy teams are all the best offenses in football. It's one Mike McDaniel far and away, and then
Right.
it's Chiefs, Lions, Rams, all the best ones. And
Yep.
so for those 2 players, you're really looking for that. And that was another knock on Worthy as well, or just like a weird concern was that his OC, or no, his head coach was Devonta Smith's OC in his Heisman winning season, where it's like, okay, maybe he knew how to mitigate the size concerns. But if you put him with like a Jeff Fisher in the NFL, like, all right, I'm really worried about Xavier Worthy. You give him a Sean
Mhm.
McVay, and I'm like, this is going to be fun. But I wanted to circle back. What was the on the importance of draft capital?
Yeah.
What was the quote you just listed off?
Ryan Riddle, who wrote some tremendous stuff for Bleacher Report back in the day from the player perspective, he said, early round picks have to prove they can't play, and late round picks have to prove they can. So, and in the end, it may not matter, because if you're an early round pick and you get multiple opportunities and you just don't have it, then you just don't have it. You don't have it on the 4th time and the 5th time and the 6th time either. But I do think that draft capital represents how long the leash is going to be, how patient a team is going to be with a player. It may not actually change the long-term outcome, but a player like Devontae Adams, I mean, he wasn't a first-round pick, but still, he was a player that Green Bay had envisioned a lot for, so they weren't just ready to move on from him when it didn't go well earlier in his career. So I think that matters, and I think it also, on the flip side, means we have to be patient with some of the later round picks, and then we can play these what if games. Like if Isaiah Pacheco got drafted to a different team, would we even be talking about him right now? So opportunity is important, but obviously what they do with the opportunity is what determines in the end what happens.
Yeah, draft capital is so predictive and so important, in part because all right, you and I talk about the assumption of rational
Yeah.
coaching a lot. Well, what about the correct assumption of self-interested GMs,
Yeah.
right? And so I always think back on Adam Thielen, who was competing against Cordarrelle Patterson, a round 1 pick, Greg Jennings, who signed a big contract, and the beat writers at the time, like rookie sophomore season, are like, this is the best wide receiver on the field. He's blowing our minds, and it took
Hmm.
him so long to break out. And then I also think about Steve Keim. I forget who the wide receiver, Trent Sherfield, I think
Hmm.
he was
Oh yeah.
interviewed after he left the organization. And he was like, yeah, I was told by a coach, you're like deserve to be a starter, but the GM doesn't want to see you play. He wants to see the drafted guys play
Hmm.
because like it makes him look bad when the UDFAs are outplaying his second round picks. And like, what about Greg Dortch? Like I've been saying for
Hmm.
years, Greg Dortch is just a better Rondale Moore, but he's a UDFA, so you're not going to see him play. And so, yeah, I have all these concerns with Brian Thomas, but ultimately wide receiver 4, and a big reason why is because of that projected draft capital. I will tell you, if we could have a little therapy session for a second,
Oh,
Sig,
please.
is there was a point during this process, because I don't remember a year with the wide receivers, where the film versus the analytics were so misaligned. Where like Adonai Mitchell, it's only red flags. There's not a single green flag in there. And for a lot of these guys, older players, not very productive, but supposedly a top 6, top 10 wide receiver in the class, where I had this moment of nihilism where I was just like, is really draft capital all that matters? And like, where it's just, you could have a clone of 2 players. One goes round 2, the other
Mhm.
goes round 6. The round 6 guys out of the league in a year. The round 2 guys, great. Like, he's a good fantasy player, but it's just, you're not invested in his success as a GM. You give them more opportunities to succeed. If you fail, you get excuses made. Uh, and yeah, and like, we don't have say over, how to use a player. We're like, I think Worthy is a guy who needs motion and all this other stuff. He's great on screens and then uses deep speed. But it's like, you give him a Jeff Fisher and it's just like, oh, this guy's a bust.
Yeah, or necessity. Quentin Johnson, I think, is a terrific example of this, where just misfortune for his team, right? And this is where I think that the film watching and even the analytics and all of the work that is done by people like you to set the scene. Here's the landscape of this player based on what we know before they get drafted. Here's where they struggle. Here's where they're strong, and so on. Quentin Johnson was a player that you could see go in the first round. I mean, well, first of all, just as a quick aside, where does Quentin Johnson rank in this class?
Oh, right.
Like 9th, 11th,
Yeah.
right? Right. Quentin Johnston. I mean, geez, you're actually looking at like Xavier Leggett, and you're like Quentin Johnston or Xavier Leggett. You know what I mean? In this class,
Yeah.
in last year's
Mhm.
class, some people had him number 1 on their board because he's big, because he's fast, and because he does know what to do once he has the ball in his hands. Now that kind of sounds like a big slot. And that's the other thing about the slot. When I say that it's segmented into 3 positions, well, geez, even slot is segmented into big slot and little slot. So it's
Mhm.
not even, you can
Mhm.
subclassify these guys based on roles within roles. But Quentin Johnston, everybody who was being honest about him said he's not ready to be an outside receiver yet. You're
Mhm.
drafting him in the first round on a projection, and if you're using him as a rookie, here's what he's proven he can do now. Well, because Williams gets hurt, because Josh Palmer gets hurt, the Chargers have to use him outside, and he looks terrible. Well, guess what? He
Mhm.
still can't do what he couldn't do. You know,
Mhm.
he's still not a contested catch guy. He's still not a guy. Yeah, he's fast. Yeah, he's big. That hasn't changed. But yeah, in the NFL, no, he's not ready for NFL competition at corner. Then you implicate confidence. So this is another thing about a player's trajectory of their career. It's confidence and how much of a role that plays, and
Mm.
whether you're given too much too early in your career, or whether you're doing like Puka Nakua. Puka Nakua from the, if you were paying attention last year, Jordan Rodriguez told us, wow, it looks like they plan on him doing a lot this year. From rookie minicamp and OTAs, she was saying that. And
Mhm.
at every point, he met their expectations. So then they added more. And then he met the expectations and they added more. I don't care what Puka Nakua was in your pre-draft rankings or even after he got taken. That's where you actually win in your and that's where you buy high, right? Oh, someone took him in the 3rd round. Maybe if I give you a future second, you'll trade him to me right now. So that's where you can win. But playing all these counterfactual scenarios, I mean, when you said clone a player, I think that's it, right? I mean, I like to say, now we're going to really go on the couch. You want to talk about therapy? I mean, I one of the things I like to say, Scott, and maybe I'm revealing too much about myself, is, thank the heavens that we don't have another version of ourselves, that we can try the other choice in our lives,
Mm.
right? It's actually a great burden lifted that you don't have to worry about whether you made the right choice or not. Because for all you know, if you had made the other choice, it'd be even worse. You would be even
Mhm.
worse off. So just keep looking forward and keep living your life like these teams. But I think that's the interesting scenario. The one that I always bring up is Bryce Young and CJ Stroud. If Bryce Young
Mhm.
had gone to the Texans and CJ Stroud had gone to the Panthers, how different are the stories we're telling about them today? How different are the stories we're telling about these franchises? I don't know, but I think it highlights how important it is.
No, I love that. I always live by everything happens for a reason, or like
Yeah.
the best outcomes, or we live in the best of all possible worlds. The best outcome is always, whatever you ultimately chose, because like you might as well just think that way, right? You're just
Yeah.
better off.
Yeah.
Um, I'm looking back at these rankings. You're
Mhm.
pretty bullish on Jonathan Brooks in
Yes.
comparison to the consensus.
Yes.
And I completely agree. Like in this class, like far and away the best 3 down potential, which is
Yes.
just massive for fantasy. In a PPR league, targets are worth 2.5 times as much as a carry, and no one other running back in this class has that upside. I also think like his ADP is going to skyrocket because he's going to be
Yep.
the first or second running back off the board, and there are some good landing spots. So why don't you tell me a little bit about Jonathan Brooks and what you're
Yeah.
envisioning in
Yeah.
terms of draft capital and ideal landing spot?
Yeah. And I think that the important thing here is that he's the only back in this class that you can comfortably project as a 3 down back, right? Unless he just doesn't get all the way back from his ACL. He has the well-rounded skill set of a 3 down back. The other backs, I mean, Trey Benson has the makings of a 3 down back, but he hasn't been used as one yet. So I think
Mhm.
that it could make us wonder, but and he'll go a little higher than Damian Pierce. But I think that people are saying sort of similar things about, well, if Damian Pierce, maybe he was in a committee in college, but he wasn't supposed to be. He didn't need to be. And we'll find that out. Well, I'm not comparing them directly, except to say that when a player you know, again, what's meaningful? You mentioned players that had low efficiency in the rookie year, like Christian McCaffrey and LaDainian Thompson. Well, what was Le'Veon Bell? What was meaningful? Was it meaningful they had low efficiency, or was it meaningful that as a rookie, their teams trusted them that much to handle that much of the offense? Well, in hindsight, we can see for all three of those guys, it was the volume and the trust as a rookie that was meaningful, not what they were able to do with it, because they were going to continue to get opportunities to refine their game. I think Jonathan Brooks, he projects as a 3 down back, comfortably as a 3 down back, unlike anyone in this class. And then what I really like about Brooks when you watch him, Scott, he looks like a veteran running back. I mean, he makes decisions like a veteran running back, right? The way he engages with contact. He's not the strongest back in this class, but he can get yards after contact. He's not the most elusive. He doesn't have the most juice, but he can force missed tackles. He's not the fastest, but he can break long runs. So he's not the superlative of anybody, any of these particular things. But when you put them all together, you have a foundational running back. And I think that he's the only one in this class. And even if he goes to Carolina, I think Dallas or Carolina is what we're looking at here. Even if he goes to Dallas or Carolina, if he goes to Carolina, I'm not going to move him out of that number one. I mean, I think my next player at running back, I think I have him sixth in a one quarterback league, and my next running back's like 18th or 19th. So it would take something pretty astounding. Because the thing about Jonathan Brooks also is, I don't even necessarily care where he lands. Even if he lands somewhere where he's blocked this year or this year next year, I mean, running back's a young man's position. It's going to churn. If the Texans draft him and he's behind Joe Mixon, I mean, by the middle of next season, he's going to take over that backfield. That might actually be the best case scenario because he's going to converge with an offense that's ascending instead of an offense like Carolina, where maybe he'll overtake Chuba Hubbard really quickly and overtake him in terms of the lion's share of the backfield touches, but in a bottom half or even bottom quarter of the league offense.
That's partly why I liked Brooks so much is like I don't see him as landing spot dependent. Like you
Yeah.
throw Blake Corum to the Panthers, that sucks. They're
Oh.
trailing every game. He's
Yeah.
not getting carries, he's not getting targets. But you put Brooks there, it's like, okay, they're trailing in every game. He's not getting a lot of carries, but now they're peppering him with targets, right?
Right.
And so volume far and away the most important or it's just about everything when it comes to fantasy running backs.
Yeah.
And so I project him to be a volume running back. One running back who it surprised me how high you were on him. I
Mhm.
actually didn't write him up, and this is the one player who, if I can find the time, maybe I'll add him
Mhm.
before the draft. Is Kimani Vidal?
Yeah.
Uh, my model has a strong bias against group of 5 running backs, and he wasn't projected to go earlier than round 5, so I never got around to him. So why don't you tell me why I should add him to my article and get excited about him?
Yeah, so many people have him listed as their favorite sleeper running back in this class. And I won't say that he's Matt Waldman's favorite sleeper running back, but certainly he's one of the running backs. If you read the Matt Waldman RSP, which you should, you will see that Waldman thinks he can play. And he is a proven volume back. Now you're right, you have to devalue that a little bit because it was at Troy. But still, I mean, there's a durability question that comes up there. And also, he had a 3 down skill set. But as I know, I mean, he's only 40th overall because he's highly likely to be a third day pick. And he's going to have to be one of those guys that can prove he can play. And again, Isaiah Pacheco is a good example where, if Isaiah Pacheco had landed somewhere else, we might not be talking about him yet. I mean, even Chuba Hubbard isn't exactly like the breakout running back, but it took a while for us to even talk about Chuba Hubbard. But I think there are others. I think that you have a sleeper running back tier. I know Blake Watson just made General Jeremiah's top 150. He's another one. Dylan Johnson, I know, is a favorite of Matt Waldman's. He's another one. So, we have these running backs that are not going to go in the top 10 running backs off the board, or it would be a surprise if they go in the top 10 off the board. But they've shown more skills and more things that translate as compared to. So here's some running backs I have below Vidal, like Isaac Guerrero or Braylon Allen. These are guys that have the physical traits that the NFL really loves, but they haven't necessarily shown the ability to unlock them with skills consistently. And it ain't going to be easier to do that in the NFL than it was in college. Bucky Irving is another guy I think that is a little bit polarizing. Bucky Irving could be another Kyron Williams. He could be another guy. Don't tell me about the measurables. Tell me what he did with the ball in his hands and show me how much of his game is based on skill. Or Bucky Irving could be like another Jaquiz Rogers, who I liked. I'd like Jaquiz Rogers a
Yeah,
lot.
me too. I was
But
a big fan.
just his limitations limited his fantasy upside. So, there's a lot of this where glass half full, glass half empty. And I think that if we're being honest as analysts, we're just trying to tell a story where we say, if this player succeeds, it will be because this, and this are the determinative factors in their outcome. And if he fails, it'll probably be because of this, and this. And then as you track their career, you start to see, okay, which path are we on? And you can maybe act before you get all the evidence. Because I think that's the number one thing you can take advantage of in fantasy football is there's so many people that are like, no, I want more evidence. I want more evidence. Can I just have one more piece of evidence before I buy into this? And if you're an early adopter, because you've massaged your brain with Scott's work, with Matt Waldman's work, with Dane Brugler's Beast, there's so many people doing great work out there. So you absorb it all, and then as you are reading and watching football, a path illuminates. You're like, oh, okay, this guy, Isaiah Pacheco, right? What did Isaiah Pacheco have going for him? Effort. Oh my gosh, effort. He ran the ball like his life depended on it. Like he had to get the message through enemy lines, or his country was going to lose the war. So once you put him next to the other options in Kansas City, yeah, he's going to stand out. Yeah, he's that, and there's going to be enough for him to stand out and then take hold of that. So you want to understand what the strengths and weaknesses are, so you understand what's coming next. And I think with this running back class, 3 or 4 or 5 of them, other than Brooks, are going to have at least some periods of fantasy relevance. I can't say which guys are going to be those guys, not yet.
Yeah, I just want to say shout out to Matt Waldman and the
yeah.
RSP. I've been a reader since the Amir Abdullah. I was going to war for Amir Abdullah, and I know he was high on him that year. Yeah, so we just talked about Vidal. I think is like one of your favorites. Who are some of your favorites? Like you're in a rookie draft. I don't want to leave the rookie draft without him. I love this guy. I'm going to keep up for him. One of my guys, Jaheim Bell. I appreciate. I saw the shout out in the article.
Yes,
he would be on my list. Who are some of the players on your list?
Well, I'll say at tight end Benson, and I know a lot of people are on the Benson train, but this is a guy that I know Matt Wall was talking about him as like the snow plow game, when he's out on the snow. And I got to talk about Dane Brugler's Beast again, because it always starts with biological information. And one of the things about him in the Beast is that he didn't play football until he was in 4th grade, because he didn't want to play flag football. He wanted to hit people, because he was a hockey player since he was 3 years old. Imagine the hockey team with him and JJ McCarthy. He was a hockey player since he was 3 years old. And he played something like 6 or 7 sports in high school, I want to say. But what I really love about Benson, and sometimes Scott, I'm an emotional fantasy football player. I'm an emotional GM. I go on hunches. Yeah, I go on gut feeling. I have to live my life coloring between the lines. My fantasy teams, I'm going to have some fun. And he just has that joyful warrior, Rob Gronkowski, George Kittle kind of approach to his game, where he likes it. He likes how brutal the tight end position is. He thrives on it. I think that Ben Sinnott And this is a really interesting tight end class because you could make an argument from a fantasy perspective for any number of, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 guys to be the number 2 tight end after Brock Bowers. And we can see with, some of these guys on the rise now, a Trey McBride, a Sam Laporta. McBride was the first tight end off the board in his class, but he wasn't this generational prospect. He was a second round pick, and he was a somewhat limited second round pick. He wasn't always going to be a do everything tight end. Now look how valuable he got really quickly. Look how valuable Sam Laporta. These are your number 1 and number 2 dynasty tight ends. Where were they at the beginning of the season last year, Scott? Were they even in the top 10? And now
No.
I think they're 1 and 2 in most rankings, or if not 1 and 2, very close to 1 and 2. And I think one of these guys, again, Bell, I think is a good example. I love the case you lay out for him in terms of analytics. Sanders has more of the prospect traits profile that will translate, and he held his own with Worthy and with Mitchell as a viable topic prospect. Eric All is interesting. We don't scout based on helmets, but at some point you have to say this program knows how to identify talent and develop it at this position, right? That's Iowa tight ends. And Eric All has the medicals that you have to worry about. But again, if a team is willing to take him in the 3rd round, you should probably be willing to take him in the 3rd round of your rookie draft.
I love it. I think one thing you're going to do way better than I can do, although I have to get started on my mock draft tonight if I'm going to do one. Best or ideal landing spots, or like worst possible landing spots, just like any landing spots you're directly rooting for. Lad McConkey, the Chiefs, does his ADP just go nuclear? Is there any landing spot for the big 3 wide receivers where you would get nervous?
Right.
Just any thoughts on these landing spots?
Yeah, I want the receiver that's paired with Kyler Murray. I think it's going to be Harrison. It should be Harrison because we saw what he did with DeAndre Hopkins. Kyler is not. I think Kyler's a great buy low right now, especially in Superflex leagues. I think he's a terrific buy low right now. And part of it is because he's going to get paired up with somebody, one of the top 3. And if it's not one of the top 3, that means they just got a boatload of picks. Okay. So then they're still going to take wide receivers. I think you're looking at a draft, not the Andy Isabella Hakeem Butler draft, but hopefully better picks than Andy Isabella and Hakeem Butler. But I think you're going to see the Cardinals go to the well more than once at wide receiver to help out Kyler Murray. But I think you also see Kyler Murray not necessarily playing with a lot of subtlety. It's like, hey, Marvin Harrison Jr. gets open on every play, and even when he's not open, he's open, and he makes the play. I'm going to throw to Marvin Harrison Jr. the same way I threw to DeAndre Hopkins. The worrisome one, I think, is Malik Neighbors to the Giants. And in a general sense, Scott, I think Saquon Barkley's implicated here, right? How do you feel about Saquon Barkley now that he's with the Eagles? Because you're going from a situation that was almost impossible to a situation that's ideal, right? So, I'll give you another example. I've seen Malik Neighbors compared to Garrett Wilson. I think that's a good comparison. In terms of like the kinds of the abilities he brings to the field, right? Now, maybe this is a reason to not be too scared of taking Malik Neighbors, the Giant, because Garrett Wilson, the Jet, even through all of his struggles, is still very, very valuable in dynasty leagues because everybody can see he can play. It's just, can he get a quarterback who can get the ball to him consistently for one of these years and stay healthy? And I think that you might be looking at that as the Neighbors' first 3 or 4 years of his career if he lands on the Giants.
So 2 things I want to say. Cardinals are in this is what they desperately need. They need an outside wide receiver 1. And so they are in the perfect spot. I've heard rumors per sources, they really like Odunze. I don't know if that's true. And, you never know with these sources stuff, but I mean Marv or Odunze on the outside is so crucial. Last year, Trey McBride, I think, ranked 15th among all players in yards per route run against zone, 2nd among tight ends. So feasting against zone. And then against man, Arizona was a bottom 3 team. Michael Wilson just about basically averaged 0.00 yards per route run against man. And Rondale Moore ranked bottom 5 of 125 qualifiers. So that is what they desperately need. I love that. I will say, and maybe it's just because I'm a Giants fan and I want them to draft Neighbors so badly, I kind of like the spot. Like I think there's a higher floor than people are giving credit for. Where like I'd be a buyer, just because like I think he can do. Uh, Brian Dable, a former wide receiver coach,
Hmm.
coached some great slots in New England. I think he could do a lot of the Wandale Robinson stuff
Right.
uh, at a bare minimum and do it at a much higher level. And then could also be their wide receiver one, where, you know, maybe the quarterback play is brutal, but like they have no one else anyway. And so volume is enough to overcome that. But
And you
that
make
could
it,
just be my go ahead.
yeah, you know, and you make it really simple with Daniel Jones. Like you set up some
Mhm.
structure around Jones, kind of like what was set up around Chris Sims, where it's like, we don't want you thinking. That's the last thing we want you to do. Like Colin Kaepernick. Maybe that's a better comparison. Like ladder, like Colin Kaepernick was never going to sit back there and go through 3 or 4 reads. They should have won the Super Bowl with him. I mean, it
Mhm.
didn't last, but I think you can do that with Daniel Jones. And kind of like what we saw with Gardner Minshew and Michael Pittman last year. Like just Neighbors is the read, Neighbors is the guy you're going to throw the ball to. You know, it absolutely could work. There's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, and then again, that all comes back to why this is so difficult. Because I'll tell you, you know, I'll wear my L's. I'll own them. I don't care. I mean, there's plenty of them. Anybody, you're not saying anything interesting if you don't leave yourself open to big L's. Probably one of my least favorite landing spots ever for a player that I liked was when AJ Brown landed in Tennessee. I think I moved him down to
Mhm.
17th or 18th in my rankings because I'm like,
Same.
like, how is he going to get it done in Tennessee? Sometimes a player
Mhm.
is just so good that all the things that seem to apply to their situation before they showed up don't apply anymore because they're that influential on the offense. And Neighbors absolutely fits that profile.
Sig, this was amazing. This is beautiful.
Yeah.
I promised you a non
Oh yeah.
football question to cap it off. I'm going to ask you, what is like some piece of media you've consumed over the past several months, whether it's a book, music,
Mhm.
TV show, movie,
Yeah.
that you've fallen in love with or you can't stop thinking about?
Yeah. Yeah. Ooh. Yeah. Um, I will go. Actually, I'll do two answers. One I'll go back to.
Mhm.
It actually goes back to football. And we've both been listening. When I say we, I mean the love of my life, Kate and I. We've been listening to Across the River, which is the book that Kent Babb, outstanding sports writer, outstanding writer, wrote when he was embedded with the Edna Carr football team here across the river on the West Bank in New Orleans. And they've won 4 straight state championships as a public school, majority African American school, which is just, if you know about the highest levels of high school football, I mean, Louisiana high school football, they're insane about high school football here. This is a football hotbed. Southeast Louisiana is right there with Miami as like the football hotbed in America. And they won 4 straight state championships. How could they possibly do it? And they let Kent Babb have complete access. They even told him, like, we want you to write everything exactly as it happens. Like, we don't want you to filter anything. It is eye opening to say the least what goes on, and especially in a place where you hear these kids saying like, I feel safe when I'm at school and I'm with the football program. What might happen when I'm not? You know, there's a lot of stories about that too. So the book is Across the River, and then Hulu did a series called Algiers America, which kicks in the next year after Across the River. And it's a little more cinematic. It's a little more overtures and operatic than all of the amazing detail and you are there kind of feeling that you get from Across the River. They're both incredible. Edna Carr, Patrick Surtain went to Edna Carr. I think one of the latest players to come out of Edna Carr was Racy McMath. Anyway, so check out if that sounds interesting to you out there, folks. The Edna Carr program, Across the River, Algiers America, but not so much media because I'm going to bring in live music because I love live music. I might love live music more than football. I did get to see a concert about 3 months ago, Lucinda Williams. And Lucinda Williams is not that, like, her stomping grounds was like, Lake Charles, the Triangle. So just like down I-10 from you in Houston, and then Austin, outlaw country. And she's still doing it. She's still out there even after she had a stroke. And we got to go see her at a little place here called Chicky-Wawa that holds like 100, 150 people. It was a really small room for Lucinda Williams, if you know who she is. And I was just in awe because it's somebody that was actually there. Somebody had, like, when she sings a song about Tom Petty, like like she was with Tom, I mean, she sings a song about Blaze Foley. Look it up, folks. Blaze Foley, Austin. She really lived it. And her music, the best way I can put it, Scott, is there's a lot of gospel music about being found, right? There's a lot of gospel music about when you're saved. But there's another side. The other side is, how does it feel when you're lost? How does it feel when you want to be saved, but you don't know if you even deserve to be saved or something like that, when you're off the path? And Lucinda Williams' music is just such a wonderful companion to those times in your life. And it really came through getting to see her. So I would recommend, check. There's an album she did called, I think, Gravel Wheels on a Dirt Road or something like that she did in the 90s. Incredible stuff. So yeah, those are some things that have stuck with me.
Well, the theme you're describing right now
Mm-hmm.
that she's uncovering with her work reminds me of my favorite writer, Dennis Johnson. The book
Yeah.
I've gifted over and over again,
Huh?
Jesus' Son.
Jesus' Son. Oh
Uh,
yeah, that's a classic.
mhm.
That makes me think of Drugstore Cowboy. Have you ever seen Drugstore Cowboy?
No,
Oh
no,
man.
I'll
So
check it
Drugstore
out.
Cowboy is set like in Oregon. It's 70s. It's a tremendous film. I think Gus Van Sant did it. I could be wrong. Put that on your list. Next time I talk to
It's
you, you better have seen Drugstore Cowboy. If you love Jesus' Son, you need to see Drugstore Cowboy.
all right. Well, I just added all these to my list. I'm gonna be selfish and try and sneak in one more question.
Okay, yeah, because I know
Just
you
in
got to
case
go.
you have one.
Yeah,
If you don't have an answer,
yeah.
that's all right. What is like a burning football topic that you haven't really talked about, but you want to talk about? For some reason, I kind of want to ask you about Belichick, and like to
Ah,
me, it's just so weird that he's not hired. So that's a possibility.
sure. Well, I mean, I think that Belichick kind of intersects with what I was going to say. Here's the burning football topic, and you're seeing it touched on. So let's talk real quickly about Belichick. Everyone should check out that Seth Wickersham. I can't remember the other writer that did it. Like
Yeah,
the,
he's so good.
because people talk to him. People tell him stuff that they
Mhm.
might not tell other people, right? So a lot of really embarrassing stuff for Belichick in that article, right? Not exactly painting Belichick, not even just Belichick, the entity as a football coach, but how he's seen or how he's thought of at this point, right? Um, the question I ask when I read that article is, why is this getting out there? Who's putting this out here and why? I mean, is it Tom Brady? Is there still some sort of like feud? I mean, you also have this documentary series that players were coming to Belichick's defense, right? And saying, why are they only portraying the negative? Even the Kraft family was like, oh, if we would have known that was what it was going to be, we might not have even contributed to it, even though there's a Kraft name on there. And there was some quotes about what the Krafts said, like Robert Kraft called Arthur Blank and said, "Don't hire Bill Belichick. You won't have a warm conversation with him." Now, I'm also going to add in here Hunter Henry. I don't know if you saw what Hunter Henry said about Jared Mayo, not about Bill Belichick, but they did ask him, "How has it changed? How has it changed with Mayo?" And he said, he's a former player. He knows where we are. He stood where we're standing. His energy lights up a room. And the other one, he said, and even the way he said it, he said something to the effect, Scott, of like, just listen to us sometimes. Try that. Try listening to us. And so
Mhm.
that was in response to how it's changed. So I think that this Belichick story intersects with the Caleb Williams story. Because what's the thing that you keep hearing? Gosh, it's painful, Scott, when you read the uh, anonymous scouts and stuff like that on Caleb Williams. They just don't understand young people. They just don't understand young people. But they frame
Mhm.
it as like, I don't know about this guy. He's hiding something. I don't know how the locker room's going to react to him. I don't know how the fans, well, how is he going to do if he faces adversity? You're just saying, he makes me uncomfortable. I don't know how to process and understand this person. And that may be why Belichick didn't really get a long look, because there's this sense of old dog and new tricks. And it's one thing to be a figurehead like McCarthy, where the team's already used to running itself and it's going to continue to run itself. That's not the Belichick program. Belichick's not going to be a figurehead. And I think that while he has something that worked at one time, I don't know if he can reach this coming generation of players, like a former player,
Mm.
like a Jared Mayo. And I do think you're going to see the cocoon and the old school, like stuck in the past thinking the NFL, the franchises that hold on to that mentality are just going to fall farther and farther behind.
Yeah, you said something about this makes them uncomfortable because they don't understand this generation. And I'm thinking about there are scattering reports from 15 years ago where it's like this player has tattoos and like that's
Right.
a red flag. So
Right.
it really could just boil down to that. But circling back to Belichick, and you have to understand, I'm biased. I'm like a huge Belichick homer
Sure.
because he's given the Giants so many Super Bowls, and I just think he's hilarious. You're saying like there's all these negative reports in that article, and that's true. The Falcons sources were like a little bit more generous. They were like, yeah, he's comfortable working with the GM. He doesn't need total control. And then there's all these other negative sources. And it's like my favorite quote, Charlie Munger, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. And it's like,
Hmm.
who has the incentive to be bad mouthing Belichick to such a degree? And it has to be Kraft, right? Because like,
Yeah.
how bad do you look if you let Brady walk, he wins the Super Bowl. You let Belichick walk, he crushes. Then you look like an absolute idiot. So
Right.
idiot. So they're like incentivized to see him fail. And then you're reading this article, and it's all these uh, GMs or people talking about, well, he thinks he's smarter than you, and so that's a big concern. Guess what? He is smarter than you.
Yeah.
Like maybe he lost touch with like the younger generation or whatever. He's too much of a hard ass. He is undoubtedly like one of the top three smartest minds who have ever lived when it comes to football.
Right.
And then like another big concern was from the Eagles and a couple other organizations was like, well, what if he just retires after he breaks the record and then you only get 3 years from him and then
Right.
you're starting over? To me, if I were an owner, like I don't care. Like I am hiring him because in those 3 years, I'm going to be made so much better off for it. Everyone within my organization is going to become so much smarter that like 3 years of Belichick is worth more than anyone else. And like, he probably just, yeah, my son's ready. And then you give the son a
Hmm.
shot or something. But
Yeah.
I could just be the world's biggest Belichick homer. But that's what I got out of the article.
No, I don't. I mean, I don't think that that's outlandish. I think you have to have the right situation, though. I mean, I'm reminded of the Giants finally winning a Super Bowl with Coughlin because that was the year that he let up. Right? That was the report. Is in
Mm,
2007 was finally the year that Coughlin's like, all right, all y'all have gotten better with my tough love, and I'm gonna actually relax a little bit. I'm gonna I trust you now. I'm gonna let you spread your wings. And I think that if Belichick could be brought into a situation where a lot of the pieces were there, but they need, and maybe the Chargers, that you needed a discipline. You needed somebody like whatever, a group of kids because mom and dad were always gone, were kind of like raising themselves. And then at a certain point, that's great because it creates independence and self reliance. But then maybe having a role model can help too, and maybe coming into that kind of situation. But the other side of that, I think, that also was mentioned in the article is if you hire Belichick, you're installing Belichick's system. You know,
mhm,
you're not going to half measure Belichick. You're not going to have. I mean, having Belichick as part of a committee, and I'm not saying you can make him an emperor, but there's the Belichick way. There's the do your job way. And when you commit to that, I don't know if it's so much the 2 or 3 years down the line. I would just come back to like, is that going to be an approach that resonates now? It's always one of those eternal questions, Scott. Like winning is the great deodorant, right? I mean, you tolerate all kinds of things when you're winning, and the
mhm.
very same things you will not tolerate when you're losing.
You
So
know
you
who
have to,
tried the
uh,
Patriot system? Matt Patricia, Josh
all of them.
McDaniels, like 7
And,
other
and I
guys.
think that Belichick himself said they were all better soldiers than
Soldiers,
generals. Right.
which is a great quote, by the way. Um, Yeah, so you just mentioned Tom Coughlin, and I'm a
Yeah.
Giants fan, like love Tom Coughlin. The one thing you hear is like even from the players who hated him at the time,
Right.
like he was such a hard ass,
Right.
but I love him so much. Like
Yeah.
I would go to war for him. I
Right.
would take a bullet. I love that man with all my heart. And I don't think you've ever heard that from Belichick. Like I don't know that he can relate to people on an emotional level where he's really just like a robot. Do your job.
Yeah.
And so like that could be holding him back. I wonder if you get to see like, well, he's doing this Pat McAfee show for
Sure.
the live stream, which is either going to be really entertaining or like not at all. But I'd like to see him kind of let his hair down a little bit and show some
Sure.
personality if he
And he
has it in
does.
him.
This time of year, right? It would always be at this time of year or before the draft, usually, like around the combine. And someone would ask him a question about like Navy football. and he would go on this 7-minute story and start like
Or fullbacks or snappers.
right, something close to his heart, and then you would see like he actually has a lot of interest, and he actually there are times that maybe he won't light up a room, but he lights up, and there is emotion, there is sentiment there. But when it came time to flip the switch to football season mode, like you're right, I don't know that he was somebody that was touchy feely, warm in any kind of way, not even like behind closed doors. When because I think the other thing is, Scott, and again, this I think is 21st century thinking, is the right management style is to evaluate each person you work with and what works for them. There is
Mhm.
no one right answer. And I don't know if Bill Belichick, I think it might be too late for him to really understand that, and that's okay because he's on the Mount Rushmore of coaches. He's not even just a football encyclopedia or supercomputer. He kind of has merged with capital F football. He's kind of like Vince Lombardi. Like you think of like he's football personified, but he's football in the rear view mirror personified. What he needs to be is like what Rich McKay's doing, the very guy that they thought was an obstacle to him being the head coach in Atlanta, isn't a consultant, is someone you
Mhm.
run things past, emeritus, who's sitting there to say, well, have you thought about this before you do that? But not necessarily somebody that has the final say. But I look forward to seeing what he's going to do, and I think that's again part of what makes the draft so much fun. If you're a New England fan, is finally you're going to get to draft in a way that's not the Belichick way, because that was the weakest part of all of his skills.
I feel like when he was there, like the GMs, I mean the scouts must have like put so much effort into like, is he a
They
personality fit? Because like more than anyone else, like he broke Mac Jones, or at least that's the narrative. Is he just like
right,
mentally broke Mac
right,
Jones and ruined him? And like
right.
Tom Brady, like okay, well he turned a backup into the greatest of all time with his coaching. That's incredible. But it also wore Tom Brady thin, and where he was trying to
Mhm.
get out and go to Tampa Bay. And so yeah, that's an important factor. I don't think you ever really hear a lot. Yeah, he makes it tougher on them.
And the word was, because people are starting to talk now. Isn't it funny when there's like years and years and years and years and years when nobody's talking because, well, that's the Belichick way, and now people are talking. The word was, I can't remember who reported this or where it was anonymously quoted, that the coaches basically got to overrule the scouts. The scouts
Mm,
would do all this work all year, and then so much would be based on, and not just personality fit, although I think you're right, that's really important. Just fit in the scheme, because the scheme was a little more rigid, or
mhm,
what they were looking for was more rigid. This is why the Patriots reportedly always had the smallest board of any team. They would always
mhm,
have a very 100, 120. This year I heard it for San Francisco it's 83. To say like this many players are draftable on our board, because you have all these filters, all these knockout factors, where you just don't look at certain players because they don't fit what you're looking for. But I think again, flexibility is so important in the NFL now. And so Patriots fans will see. That's in some ways where the real draft starts, if Jaden Daniels goes number 2. But the good news is we won't be talking about ifs in a couple of days.
well, I'm excited for that. We definitely gonna do a show together,
Yes.
maybe on your home turf after the draft, talk about some of
Hmm.
these landing spots. Sig, thank you so much for having for coming on.
Yeah.
Um, you want to tell the folks at home anything about what you're cooking up, your podcast,
Sure.
your home site,
Hmm.
footballguys.com, now home to Football Writer of the Year, Adam Harstad. Shout out
Yeah. Isn't
Adam.
that awesome?
It's great. So overdue. So overdue.
Yeah, well, and what I love is it gives me so much hope for our community that someone like Adam Harstad can be the football writer of the year, because I could never dream of being as esoteric as he is, as far as jumping between references and taking something out of psychology or something out of science and applying it to football, to fantasy football. We're going to be live during the first round, Matt Waldman and I and a bunch of guests just reacting. I mean, not whatever. We'll have plenty of time to comb through all of this and do our rookie rankings and react to what happens in the draft in a actionable advice way. But the fun thing during the draft is hanging out with your people and just experiencing all the oohs and ahs that happen, the laughter, the tears, and everything in between. We'll be doing that. And then Cecil and I will be on the Audible on our podcast going through division by division the following week. Bloom 100 with post draft rankings will come out probably Tuesday. If you want to hit me on Monday, if you have a draft going on, it's fun. maybe fly on instruments. I don't know. I don't know if I'm right or not, but it's great, man. And I'm just glad that we get to spend this time together. And most importantly, like Adam Harstad, like Matt Waldman, like all these people we're talking about, the fantasy football world is really great at just letting us be us, right? We aren't trying to all be like each other. In fact, we're trying to be more, we're not trying to not be like each other. We're just trying to be like ourselves, which makes each of us offer something that only we can offer. And we owe the audience a lot of gratitude for that, because there aren't many places where you go to work and feel like you can just show up to work and be yourself.
I love that. Folks at home, that's a takeaway for you. Don't try and be anyone else. Just try and be more like yourself.
Yeah.
Sig, this was a blast. You killed it. Thanks for coming on. See you guys all soon.